Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us here today. I appreciate that. I know how busy our schedules are and all that we've got on our plates right now as school leaders. So I really do appreciate folks tuning in with us here today. My name is Brian Campbell, and I am the director for the Bureau of Curriculum Assessment and Instruction here at the department. And I welcome you to the first of two webinars we're going to have to look at the local assessment data that folks are submitting to PDE voluntarily for analytics. This is part of our extended accelerated roadmap resources. If you're familiar with that system, if not, please jump on our website and check it out. The accelerated learning system and the roadmap are a collection of vetted resources we have for folks as we pivot from last year's focus on health and safety and keeping our schools open for our kids during the pandemic, and as we move forward now looking at how the pandemic and the lost opportunities for teaching and learning may be affecting our schools and our students. So part of that resource was allowing you to submit some local assessment for analytics that you can use in addition to testing scores and some of the other things provided for the state, and often use in the place we know the 1920 assessments were suspended by USDE completely. So we wanted to make sure we give folks an additional data point for decision making and for driving the instruction. In addition to the reporting that we're going to talk about today, again on the website. And if you want to, if you're struggling to find that, you can always just reach out to me. On the roadmap are some resources to tie your instruction to some of these results. So I'm going to turn over the analytics part of this discussion to our expert, which is certainly not me. We have with us today John White, and John is the Vice President of SAS PVAAS, and he is the director of the PVAAS project in the state of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to let John take you through the analytics for our local assessments project.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. So today, as Brian said, we're going to be spending some time walking through some of the information that we are going to be able to provide with some of the local assessment data that was submitted. We'll try to get into some of the background on interpreting some of the results that you'll be finding, but I will just go ahead and jump right into the presentation. Hope I can answer all the questions that the different folks have today, but happy to share some of this information with you all. So let me try to share my screen real quick to make sure that that is going to work. All right. Yeah, and as Brian said, just to introduce myself again, so I'm a VP at SAS, just oversee all the work that we do at SAS with value-added modeling, growth modeling, predictive analytics in the K-12 education space. I've been working with Pennsylvania for quite some time, probably the last decade or so. I've been with SAS for about 15 years. My background is in statistics, so I'm going to try to help work through some of the analytics involved in this project. But with all that, I will go ahead and jump right into it. Yeah, so let me try to get rid of some of these boxes on top of my screen from Zoom. So yeah, what's the overall purpose of the local assessment project and all the analysis and reporting that it'll provide? So as Brian already said, we know that the state assessments were canceled in the 1920 school year. There were delays in the 2021 school year in terms of testing that you guys are all very familiar with, being in the positions that you're in. And so local assessment data was still administered in many cases in many LEAs across Pennsylvania, specifically in the 1920 school year at the beginning and middle of the school year, maybe not the end of the school year due to school disruptions, but in the 2021 school year, many times in the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. And so we've taken all of that information and are hoping to be able to provide some useful data to you all. specifically looking at how some of the decisions that you guys have made, how that impacted students through those 1920 and 2021 school years. Trying to help provide information about planning into the coming 2022 school year, and then also just how to allocate efforts and resources moving forward. So without those state summative assessments, we're hoping that this really provides some information for those of you that elected to submit that data up to the state. So there are really three types of reporting that are going to be made, possibly going to be made available. The first is a data summary report, and that's for all of the LEAs that submitted the local assessment data. I believe that information either has gone out or is going out very soon. I believe it has already gone out. And then the next two pieces of information are web reporting, just like you receive in the PVAAS system, specifically for those local assessments rather than for just the state summative assessments. So you will see data alongside your state summative value-added information in the PVAAS web system for some of your local assessment data. We're not necessarily focusing on that part of the reporting in this talk today, but rather we're focusing on this third part, the analysis of unfinished teaching and learning. And those reports are going to be made specifically for LEAs where the local assessment data met some of the project criteria. And so we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through the presentation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the model itself that we're going to use and the analytics to provide results back to you. And then ultimately, what are those outputs coming out of those models? How can we interpret what those outputs are? And what's really important here is trying to understand kind of what is a meaningful result, what is not. So we'll spend quite a bit of time talking through that idea. We'll talk about an example of information that would be provided back. We'll use the CDT data. We're actually going to use, I believe, Acadian's data in looking at that. And then also talking a bit more about how the data can be used in the field. So again, this will be kind of the agenda for today as we walk through some of the presentation. All right, so this is a new type of analysis. It's not something that we have done before because there hasn't necessarily been a need to do this prior to the pandemic. But it's all around the idea of how can we quantify the pandemic's impact on student learning and student achievement. And so one way that we're going to do this is compare students' projected performance. What we mean by projected performance is we're going to project out into the future prior to the pandemic on where students should have ended up or where they were expected to end up. And we're going to compare that to their actual performance on some of these local assessments. We're going to aggregate those comparisons across all students as well as for individual student groups, such as our English learners or economically disadvantaged students, or maybe for the different race categories, and ultimately trying to determine if we saw differences among the different groups that we're looking at. And we're trying to really assess whether students underperformed relative to that pre-pandemic expectation. And again, we'll get more into some of the details here. But as an overview, again, we're trying to provide an answer to the question of how did the pandemic affect student learning and how did these school disruptions really affect student learning? And where were there differences in terms of this impact? Was it for certain types of student groups at certain time points? So we will look into all of those. We are going to look at, both the beginning and the middle of the year to see if there was any difference between the very first part of the year towards the middle of the year. And we're also going to try and see if we can update some of this reporting annually. We know we will do it within the PVAAS web reporting site. Whether or not we'll do it on the unfinished teaching and learning side, I think we will kind of see how things move into the future and where we are. So If you have assessments that have met the project criteria, and if your LEA specifically has met some of the project criteria, you will receive a report in the late fall of 2021. It'll be sometime in the near future. And that report is going to be emailed to each of your LEA superintendents or CEOs from the PVAAS statewide team under the direction of Kristen Leewald. So that is where you will get the information from. This report is not necessarily going to be made available within the PVAAS web reporting application, specifically the one around unfinished teaching and learning. And for those LEAs that did not meet project criteria, a communication is also going to be sent with reasons why. Many of those reasons why will just be at the test level, meaning we did not receive enough data for this specific test in order to create these reports, and we'll get into some more of that in a little bit. So that is going to be most of the cases. For the assessments that we could actually use to create these metrics, you may have some more nuanced detail if your specific LEA was not able to receive a report in terms of not having enough data within your LEA itself, even though that test could get some reporting for unfinished teaching and learning. All right, so how, again, are we going to measure unfinished teaching and learning? There are really 4 key questions here that we're going to go through. So based on students' prior achievement, how would we have expected those students to perform in the absence of the challenges presented by the pandemic? So how would we expect them to perform based on seeing a pre-pandemic experience play out? And then how do they actually perform through the challenges of school disruptions presented by COVID? So once we have how they actually performed and how they were projected or expected to perform, we want to compare those 2 different results. So we want to compare the actual observed values to these expected values and see how they differ. And we're also going to look at different student groups to see if there was a different experience across those various student groups. Now, you may all be familiar with the term projection. That's something that is available within the PVAAS web reporting system. So I just want to remind you about a couple of things regarding those PVAAS projections. They are more of a proactive planning tool. So they look out into the future for students. That's generally how we use them. They are available to specific users that have access to student level data. And the whole underlying idea is, given a specific set of circumstances, what is the most likely outcome for the student on a specific test as we move into the future? So it bases that idea on the prior testing history for a student that's not taken an assessment yet. So in a normal example, if we were to project a 7th grade test score, we may use all of the students' testing history up through the 6th grade. Maybe the student just recently tested in the 6th grade, and so they haven't taken that 7th grade assessment yet. So in addition to the individual students' testing history, we're going to use the testing histories for all of the students who just took that 7th grade assessment in our example. So these projections help with a lot of different things. They can help with course placement or classroom differentiation. They can help with college and career planning. And of course, in our case, they can help with measuring unfinished teaching and learning. And I can get into the specifics of that in just a moment. But you may be familiar with the PVAAS projections as they exist on the site. This is just an example of a projection for a student that has probably most recently been in the 7th or 8th grade math. Ultimately, we're projecting out into the Algebra 1 assessment that they have not taken yet. And we're providing, on the reporting at least, probabilities that the student would reach some of these different performance levels. So you can see that they're projected to score just above that proficient line and have a 65% chance that they would be proficient or higher on that Keystone assessment when they were to take the Keystone assessment. And that's based on the average kind of schooling experience and their own prior testing data. So one thing, just to get kind of out there, that's a little bit different than maybe what you're seeing on the web reporting or what you're familiar with on the web reporting. In the web reporting, we're typically providing or presenting this information in terms of a probability of success or probability that the student is going to achieve a certain performance level or higher, such as that 65% chance. But the actual projection model itself does create a projected score or an expected score. So it does provide an expected score as well as some information about how precise that expected score is. And again, I know we're kind of reiterating this, but it's based on the student's own prior testing history, as well as how the cohort of students who just took that assessment performed. So if we were to make a projection in a given normal year to 7th grade math for a student that was most recently in the 6th grade, we would base it on their own prior testing history, as well as how the most recent cohort of students who took that 7th grade math assessment did, and connecting it to their own prior testing history. So how would educators expect their students to perform? This projected score that we will create for this project is a projected score based on the experience prior to the pandemic. So an individual student is going to receive a projected score to their 2021 beginning of year and end of year, or sorry, beginning of year and middle of year assessment. So with your local assessments, we generally had a beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year assessment. But in the 2020 school year, we only had beginning and middle of year. So what we're doing with this is really focusing in on the beginning and middle of year, because that's the data that we had in the 2020 school year. So again, we're going to create a projected score to the 2021 beginning and middle of year assessment for each of the students. We're going to base that projected score on the prior testing history and the average schooling experience. And the average schooling experience is going to be based on the observed growth of students who took the state assessment, who took the assessment prior to the pandemic. So let me let me skip around just a little bit. So again, what we will have are students testing data in the 1920 school year, which is our most recent set of completers of those local assessments. So if you think about the 1920 school year, the pandemic didn't impact students until the end of the 2020 school year. So the beginning and middle of year assessment scores for the 1920 school year happened prior to the pandemic. We would look at that data in relation to the data from the 1819 school year to build an expectation that's all based on the prior experiences prior to the pandemic. And then we will use that model to create these expected scores for the 2021 school year. So with the local assessments, again, the actual performance is the student's test score on the BOI or MOI from 2021. We also have the BOI and MOI from the 1920 school year as a comparative reference point. And once we have these projected and actual observed scores, we're going to compare where the students were expected to be versus where they actually ended up. So again, these expected scores for the beginning and middle of year for 2021 are based on a pre-pandemic experience. We know that where we are in the beginning and middle of year for 1920 is all based on pre-pandemic experience, but where we are based on the 2021 school year at the beginning and middle of year happened post school disruptions because of COVID. So once we have these two different groups and their comparisons, we'll indicate the extent that students experience learning and diverge from that pre-pandemic experience. And once we have those two different comparisons, we'll also start to compare students of different student groups. So again, we'll look at things like English learners versus our economically disadvantaged students or the different racial backgrounds to see if different students experience different things in that 2021 school year. So I think this kind of illustrates one of the things that we're talking about here. We will follow a student up through the 2018-2019 school year. In the state summative case, we wouldn't have any data for the 2020 testing year. So we might project to the 2021 school year. And then that's based on our pre-pandemic experience. Ultimately, we would have observed scores in ELA and math on those state summative assessments. That's not something that's going to be in this report, but just to illustrate the idea, we will have information about where the students were actually ended up in the 2021 school year, and that potentially is going to be below, where they were expected to score based on this pre-pandemic experience. Again, this is a little bit different because we're providing an example based on the state summative data. And this project, we're focused more on the local assessment information. So I just want to, before we get into interpreting results, I want to back up and just make sure that we definitely have this clear. Sorry for the multiple, well, let me just say. In the local assessment project, we have students. We really have to have 3 years of assessment data. We have the 18-19 school year, the 19-20 school year, and the 20-21 school year. So we have to have those 3 years of data to be able to do this type of report for local assessments, because we base this pre-pandemic experience on the test takers at the beginning and middle of year of the 19-20 school year. So just to walk through an example, we have the beginning of year in 1920. Let's say we have someone taking the NWA MAP assessment in 5th grade at the beginning of year in 1920. That's prior to the pandemic. We relate those test takers of that test to the beginning and middle year test scores they have from the previous grade of the prior year in 18-19. So that we can create an experience or a relationship between, let's say, 4th grade math and 5th grade math, moving from one year to the next. That relationship is based on, again, pre-pandemic experiences. So once we have established that relationship in that model, if you will, we can apply it to the 1920 school year test takers in order to project out to the future the 2021 test score for the beginning of year on those MAP assessments. So again, we would have beginning and middle of year test scores from 1920 projecting out to the future that 2021 test score at the beginning of the year based on pre-pandemic experiences. Now we know the 2021 test score actually happened through the pandemic. So this is post-pandemic experience. And so to the extent that that test score deviates from the 1920 expectation, if you will, that means there's been more impact on student achievement than maybe what we would see in that 1920 school year prior to the pandemic. So again, we base the relationships and model, if you will, on the experience of students that took a test, let's say at the beginning of the year in 1920. We relate it to their prior test scores. And then we apply that model or those relationships to a different set of students. Those students' test scores at the beginning and middle of year of the 1920 school year, predicting out to the future, the test score of the 2021 school year. Once we have that expected score for 2021, we can compare the observed scores from the 2021 school year to this pre-pandemic expected score. All right, so now that we kind of have that model established, if you will, we need to talk about how do we actually interpret these results. So if we look at the difference between these projected scores and actual scores, how do we know if something is meaningful, if it's practically significant? How can we compare different results if we're talking about local assessment data using something like MAP or STAR, or even the data that we might use or might see for something like the PSSAs later when those results come back? So the answer here is we would like to convert all of these results to something called effect sizes. So let me go through why we feel like that's the important way to do this and one way that would help interpretation of the data. So let's say on one of these assessments, we compare an actual score for a group of students to the projected scores, and we get a difference of something like -10 scale score points. So they were expected to score up at a 210, but they actually scored on average at a 200. So the difference here is they fell short by 10 scale score points. So is that a meaningful difference? Does that mean anything to anyone in terms of how to interpret the data? And I think ultimately it really depends on the context. It depends on, the idea of what does 10 scale score points mean? And is that a meaningful difference? Well, to give you an example, if you think about something totally different, think about the length of something, we can say, is the difference of an inch a meaningful difference? And it depends on the context or what we're actually talking about measuring. So if we're measuring human height, maybe an inch is somewhat meaningful. If we're talking about the length of a race car track, maybe an inch is not as meaningful. If we're talking about the length of a pencil, an inch would probably be very meaningful in terms of a large difference. So what does this really boil down to? It's really about the idea of what kind of variation do we see in the population of what we're measuring. So if we think about the variation of human height or the range or just the spread of human height, that helps us to put the context of a difference of an inch. It helps us to put a difference of an inch into context. So if I said a difference of a foot in terms of height, I think you would go around thinking about all the people that you know and how tall they are or how short they are and say, yes, the difference of a foot in terms of height is a very meaningful difference. So it's a way that we can, again, just kind of judge or classify differences in the context of observed variation and determine whether or not it's meaningful. So this is a normal distribution. What a normal distribution is just the idea of a bell curve, if you will. Why is it called a normal distribution? It's generally called a normal distribution because things are quote unquote normally distributed this way. So in our example of human height, for example, there's a mean, which is at the center, so the middle of the distribution. That mean represents the average height, let's say, of humans in general. And then there's a spread or some variation, which is kind of the width of this distribution. And the height of this curve represents how much of that population is at each of these different areas in terms of height in our example. So if this was the average height and this is a very, very, very tall height, you can see that the percentage or proportion of the distribution that's above that height is much, much smaller when we get out to the tails. The tails just being the far right and the far left side of the distribution. So one way to quantify the variation is this concept of a standard deviation, which is what these lines represent. These lines represent one standard deviation above and below the center of the distribution. There's kind of a rule of thumb here when you're talking about the percentage of the population that is within these bounds. So to give you some context, we know that 68% of the entire population is between +1 and -1 standard deviations from the mean, or 95% of the population is within +2 or -2 standard deviations. So again, thinking about standard deviations is just a way to quantify the amount of variation that we see in a population or in a distribution. So it's a value or a metric that we can use to quantify, again, the variation of that distribution. Again, 68% of the data being within one standard deviation, 90% of the data being within two standard deviations. And it's important to note that student achievement data definitely follows a normal distribution too, meaning the majority of kids test towards the center of the distribution. Fewer students test to the far left, fewer students to the far right. So generally, student achievement is normally distributed as well. So one of the reasons that we're using effect sizes is because we can put context around these differences in terms of where kids were expected to score versus where they were observed to score. And going back to my example, if a group of students on average fell short of their projected scores by 10 points on a specific assessment, is it meaningful? Well, it also depends on the assessment, and it depends on differences that we're seeing in terms of those scale scores. And again, the variation can really help us understand this. So if we have two different assessments, for example, and one has scale score units between 0 and 100, and another one has scale score units between 0 and 1000, clearly there's different ranges or variation of these underlying scale score units. And a difference of 10 points on assessment A versus assessment B could be very, very different from one another. But let's say in a different example, students fell short by 10 points in assessment A, but 80 points in assessment B. Which group was more impacted by the pandemic? It's really hard to understand because they're totally different scales that are being used by these two assessments. So again, we can kind of standardize these values, if you will, to put some context around it. So these are real examples of some of the standard deviations. If you think about the CDT test with the scale that it has and look at the variation of grade 5 math, we see that standard deviation is 150 scale score points. So again, just to put that in context, that means 68% of the students in 5th grade math test between plus or minus 150 from the mean of the 5th grade math student achievement distribution. In contrast with the grade 5 MAP data, the standard deviation units are only 17. So 17 points, that means a change in scale score points and a value of 10 on the MAP versus the CDTs would mean something very, very different from one another. STARS somewhere in between. So the Renaissance Learning STAR assessment in grade 5 math is more like a 119. This is, with actual real data from Pennsylvania to give you an idea of what the differences are there. So given all of this, there's a lot of things that we're kind of like juggling in our mind. What's the scale of the test? We have these standard deviation units. Is there an easier way to understand all of these things that can make it easier on educators to interpret some of the results? And that's where we come back to this idea of effect sizes. Some of you may have already heard this term before, but it is a standardized metric. It allows us to put context around the differences to tell whether or not they're meaningful. It also allows us to compare things across assessment subjects and grades. So what that effect size is the difference between the observed and projected score in scale score units divided by the standard deviation of that test achievement distribution. So now we say, in terms of our differences between observed and expected, we can say, well, that is a difference of negative 0.5 in terms of an effect size. That roughly means a half of a standard deviation unit. So you can think about moving a half of a standard deviation unit relative to this normal distribution. And that's a pretty significant move if you were to think of just one example of an effect size. So there's been a lot of talk, a lot of literature around the idea of categorizing effect sizes and what is something that's small or medium or large. We have a couple of different folks that have some previous research in this area. Cohen was more of just social sciences in general. Hattie, something more specific to John Hattie, more specific to education, specifically kind of classroom level interventions. So he had a value of an effect size of 0.4. So that's 0.4 standard deviation units was seen as the average across all of these different interventions. And so he described that as a hinge point or something to look at as a meaningful difference. Kraft more recently looked at a lot of educational research and said that in general, in education, these effect sizes should be considered smaller in terms of meaningful differences. So maybe something less than a 0.05 is small, 0.05 to 0.20 would be medium, and greater than 0.20 is large. Now, every one of these researchers would say the same thing. They think that you should relate effect sizes to data that you're actually looking at. So connect it to something in your field, connect it to education, connect it to specifically what you're interested in. So what about PVAAS and what about PSSA in terms of differences of where students are scoring in a given year versus where they're expected to score? And maybe we step back to the 2019 data to look at creating a model where kids were expected to score based on the average experience that year versus where they actually did score. What I mean by that is, on average, that means kids scored where they were expected to score, since we based the model on that 2019 data. And then we aggregated all that up to the school level to try and determine what is a large effect size in terms of the average effect size at a school level, both at the top and bottom end of the distribution. And what we basically saw was that, the bottom 10% or the lowest 10% of schools on average were somewhere around a 0.20 or negative 0.20. So that means that the 10th percentile in terms of this difference between observed and expected scores, aggregated to the school level, the bottom 10% experience an effect size of negative 0.20 or less. Same kind of thing on the top end. The top 10% experience an effect size on average at the school level of about 0.20 or above. So it puts some context around the idea of what kind of thresholds we should consider in terms of looking at effect sizes. In the report, we do provide some of this information to you all to put some context around the data that you're seeing with respect to the unfinished teaching and learning. So we can talk a little bit about that in a moment. So when we see positive values, those are going to indicate observed results being higher than we were expected. So our observed data in the 2021 school year was higher than where we were expecting those students to score. When we have negative results, which is much more likely in comparing kind of an observed pandemic experience to a pre-pandemic expectation. So negative results are more likely because on average at the state level, that is what has happened. These represents observed, the negative results represent the observed results being less than expected. So again, we'll see more on the negative side. You definitely want to consider the number of students that you're looking at with these reports. You know, with assessment practices, sometimes the numbers of students taking the assessments could be all over the place. In many cases, especially for the CDT assessments, the number of LEAs that administer these assessments year after year, grade after grade to students in order for us to create these expectations is not as high as just the number of LEAs that administer the CDT assessments in general. So, you know, pay attention to all of the counts of students when you're interpreting some of the data. And we also want to compare to historical trends, and I'll get to some of that with an actual example. So we really considered in the unfinished teaching and learning project, I know this was, some of this was with respect to CDT, so we had 17-18 data. But in general, we really focused on the 3 years of 18-19, 19-20, and 2021. We pulled all of the local assessments that met these requirements of having enough data. Those 4 different assessments in terms of unfinished teaching and learning were really the Renaissance Learning STAR assessments, the NWA MAP assessments, Acadience assessments, and the CDT assessments. So those assessments were pulled across the LEAs that administered them to go through this example. We defined the time periods very specifically. So the beginning of the year was August, September, and October. And if you tested students multiple times in that 3-month span, we would take the earliest test date for each individual student. We had a middle of year time point. And again, practices are very different in different school districts, but in order to create some sense of test priority, we prioritized December and January 1st. And if you had a student with multiple assessments there, we would take the earliest. And then the second priority, if a student did not have a test available in December and January, but they had one in November or February, then we would take the earliest test date from that 2-month block. And then for the end of year, which, you know, isn't as much relevant for the unfinished teaching and learning, is March, April, May, June, and we would have taken the latest test date. That's going to be more relevant when we measure growth. Again, I feel like we should spend a decent amount of time talking about this part. This is to try and go over what I was saying before in terms of the model and creating the pre-pandemic experience and then applying it to these 2 different groups. So we define the pre-pandemic experience using students' test scores on the beginning of year and middle of year from the 19-20 school year. So the beginning and the middle of year were prior to school disruptions in the 19-20 school year. We relate those test points, each by themselves, to the students' test scores on the BOI and MOI from the 18-19 school year. So in order for us to establish the pre-pandemic experience or relationship, for example, you would take the BOI from 19-20 and relate it to the BOI and MOI of that same student to the 18-19 school year. You do that for all students that took a specific 5th grade math beginning of year assessment in 19-20 to their 4th grade math BOI and MOI assessments from 18-19 to establish these relationships. So by establishing the relationships, you've created this idea of a pre-pandemic experience. So once you do that, given any BOY and MOY test score of a given grade for a student, you can project out to that next grade BOY or MOY test score. So it allows us to create these expected scores. We do this for two different groups of kids. One is our control group, which is really what the model is based on. So you'll see these are the students that actually took the 2019 BOY or MOY in the 1920 school year. So that's the same group as we're defining up above. And we're going to ask what was this experience of this group, knowing that we established the relationship based on all of the LEAs that administered these assessments. Therefore, your LEA may have scored slightly higher than the average or slightly lower than the average, but it allows us to look at what was your experience with that given year relative to the average experience across that year. However, what's different is in the COVID group, we're actually looking at the students that took the BOY or MOY in the 2021 school year. Those are the observed test scores. We've projected out to the future based on their 1920 BOY and MOY test scores to create the pre-pandemic expected score, but we're going to compare that to the 2021 observed BOY and MOY test scores. So this group actually did experience the disruptions because of COVID and the pandemic. And so this is, we're going to call the COVID group, if you will. And we're going to say, how does this experience of this group differ from the control group's experience for your specific LEA? All right, so once we have that, so we have with these two groups, we have both observed scores and expected scores. Expected scores are always based on pre-pandemic experience, but we have our observed scores for our control group and our COVID group. And we also need to create effect sizes for each of these two different groups. So we are going to use the student level distribution of student achievement for each of these local assessments from the 1920 school year prior to the pandemic to create or provide that standard deviation so that we can standardize these differences of observed and expected scale scores. So once again, we have that difference, we divide it by that standard deviation, and now we have an effect size for both the control and COVID groups. Notice that the standard deviation used in both the control and COVID groups are the same. So differences between these groups are not due to the differences in standard deviations. We're trying to look to see whether or not the COVID group is much more negative than our control group. And if that is the case, then the COVID group fell short of their pre-pandemic expectations. So we can walk through an actual result here. What you may notice in some of this reporting, well, I should say a couple of things. One, the color coding is likely to be different than what you're seeing here. It's colored red right now. The color will likely be a different color coding scheme, but just an illustrative point, on your report, you may see if you administered the Acadience assessments with the ELA composite in grade 1, if you administered it in the beginning of year and middle of year, we have these two different groups. So if I can walk through just how to interpret what we're seeing, you have 415 students that took the BOY in 2020 in that 1920 school year that had enough data in the 2019 school year to create an expectation. And on average, those students scored right where they were expected to score. So there was no difference between their observed and expected scores, and that's why the effect size is 0. To illustrate a point though, if you did not administer the BOY in the 2021 school year, then you might not have data for the BOY in 2021 or your COVID group. Or maybe you didn't administer the middle of year data in the 2020 school year for the prior grade, so you didn't have enough data to create an expected score for these students. Regardless, there was data missing so that we couldn't create an expected score, or there were no observed scores for the ELA grade 1 beginning of year test takers from the 2021 school year. And so in that case, you do not see an effect size for that particular record. However, with Acadian's middle of year test scores in both the 2020 control group as well as the 2021 COVID group, there is enough data to get both an observed and expected score for 410 students in the 2020 year, for 400 students in the 2021 year. I would say the count of students is comparable from one year to the next. What you'll notice is the effect size is somewhat negative for the 2020 control group, but more negative for the 2021 COVID group. In fact, the difference in effect sizes, which is on the far right, is a value of negative 0.44. That is a fairly negative difference in thinking about the categorizations that we were looking at before. So that would be flagged as a pretty significant difference in that COVID group versus the control group. So I just want to walk through this a little bit again. For the control group, just trying to interpret the effect size of negative 0.25, what that tells us is that your LEA performed a little lower than average based on all of the other LEAs that administered that same local assessment, the Acadian's ELA MOI grade 1 assessment in the 2020 school year. So you performed a little lower than what you saw on average across all those LEAs. In the 2021 school year, this is a comparison to where you were expected to score based on pre-pandemic experience and using the ELA kindergarten BOI and MOI data from 2020 to project out to the future in 2021 of where students should have likely been. You can see that that effect size is a negative 0.70. So they fell short of where they were expected to score, but they fell even shorter than where they were expected to score relative to that 2020 group. And so that's why we have that difference in effect size column on the far right hand side to help interpret what this data is really saying. All right, there are other examples where you might look at specifically economically disadvantaged students. So maybe your school district is split fairly evenly into economically disadvantaged versus not. On the left-hand side, you would see the count of students in 2020 and 2021. So our control and our COVID group that were not economically disadvantaged, and then ultimately the difference in effect size for that group. And then you would also see the same information on the right for those students that were economically disadvantaged to try and gauge whether or not the difference in these effect sizes across 2020 to 2021 was different for our economically disadvantaged no versus yes students. And in this example, it does appear that the difference in terms of effect size for our economically disadvantaged yes students was more substantial or significant than the non-economically disadvantaged students. We will also provide this information down to the individual school level. So not only will you get overall subject grade data for your LEA, as well as overall student group data for your LEA, you will also get data that summarizes by subject and grade what you saw at your each of your individual schools, whether those are elementary, middle, or high schools. You can see that same type of data. So in this example, we have a grade 2 and grade 1 MOI data for this specific elementary school, where you can see that the COVID group did experience less. They fell short of their expectation, their pre-pandemic expectation, more than the control group did. You will not always see negative values in this difference in effect size column. Sometimes there will be values more towards 0 or values that are positive. But it is, again, to go through an example of just interpretation on the bottom. In grade 2, this is saying this elementary school performed on average better than the average experience across all LEAs in 2020, because that's where we created the model based on that control year in 2020. However, the observed values compared to the pre-pandemic expectation in 2021, students fell short. So you can see that while on average they may have been doing better than the average LEA in 2020, that 2021 group is doing worse than the 2020 by comparison. And so our difference value is negative. All right, so there are a lot of different uses of this information. Ultimately, we're trying to provide some data to quantify the overall impact on student achievement. That information is all going to be split apart by subject and grade based on the local assessments that you administered and the amount of data that your LEA provided. We're going to look to see whether or not the impact varied by different schools within your LEA. If you have multiple schools administering those local assessments, we're going to see if the different groups of students had different impacts as well in terms of, or different results as well, or outcomes. So for our economically disadvantaged, or English learners, or our gifted students, or our students with IEPs, all of those different students are going to be looked at and summarized in these reports to see if there are some student groups that were more impacted than others. We will also be able to compare the BOY to MOY data. So one thing that's of interest is if your LEA was very far below expectations at the beginning of the year, but maybe made up some of that ground by the middle of the year, that is something to consider. Just anecdotally, I would also say that if your school district was administering remotely the beginning of year assessment, but then in person, the middle of year assessment, I would reflect on that when looking at these results, because those could certainly create changes. So yeah, and it also helps us just determine exactly how far behind, or quantify how far behind these students are. So in some cases, you'll notice that there aren't a lot of negative differences and things are closer to 0. What that means is student achievement did not drop as much as maybe it was on average across the state. So maybe your LEA was able to maintain some of that achievement even through the school disruptions. So we hope that a lot of this information will be helpful in terms of where students are. Kristen, I don't know maybe if you wanted to talk about this or if you wanted me to, but it sounds like we will be offering some one-on-one sessions to consult in terms of some of the results and help LEAs understand what their data is saying specifically in order to just get the best out of the results and the best out of the data provided to you. All right, I think with that, we can open it up to some questions if we have some.
Sure, and if you've got a question, if you can type it into the chat, please. Kristen and I can monitor the chat. And while those come in, Kristen, I don't know if you wanted to say any more about the one-on-one trainings.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so we know that, for every district that will be receiving this unfinished teaching and learning report, that You had your own local assessment that you administered, and you're probably going to have questions that are very specific to your context. And so that's why we wanted to offer, one-on-one virtual consultation, with your team. We also would say there might be some questions that we'll need to loop back to, John White and his team at PVAAS, but, to get answered, because this is new for all of us. But we will get answers to your questions, as you're looking at that information. So, please don't hesitate to reach out. We will be emailing that report when PVAAS, has those all completed. We will be emailing the report directly to the superintendent or CEO for each LEA that will receive the unfinished teaching and learning reporting. And if there is an assessment, as John indicated, that for some reason they weren't able to provide some reporting, we will also provide information back as to why, why not, for example. So SAS is doing a wonderful job on putting those details together, which, we very, very much appreciate. John, if I could ask a question, as we were, one thing I know is we were talking to LEAs across the state about submitting local assessment data. One piece of information we heard frequently was we already have tons of information coming back from our local assessment itself, that comes back from that local assessment provider, whatever that may be. So we have the data. And I guess, what seems interesting to me in terms of listening to today is a key piece of information that's coming back is that effect size. So schools and districts may have information that says, here's what differences are in test scores, pre-pandemic, but the differentiator here is that meaningful? So is a difference of 40 points, pre to post pandemic meaningful or not? And that to me feels like a significant differentiator that this is adding, to local, districts and schools as they're thinking about the impact of COVID. Is that fair to say? And you can tell me if I'm off target on that one.
No, I think it's fair to say for sure. And I guess, there's kind of a lot of things that might be slightly different. A lot of times with the local assessments, so some of the various assessment providers, you're administering an assessment throughout the year to watch the progress of the student. Part of what's a little bit different here is we're going from one year to the next, because the school disruptions really happened towards the end of the 2020 school year. And then ultimately things started to somewhat resume, depending on your LEA, in the 2021 school year. And the idea being, where did we expect kids to start the 2021 school year just based on where they were in previous years? This analysis allows us to do that. To do that with some of the local assessments, maybe they would have needed to say, all right, based on where the student was in the middle of year 1920, where do we expect them to be at the beginning of the year in 2021? Now, of course, you can watch things like normal curve equivalents or national norms as they change through time to see whether the student kind of shifted downward relative to some stable national norm. And that's certainly going to be something that we're also looking at on the growth side. But maybe some of that would be available within the system. But in a lot of cases, it's the kid takes the beginning of the year assessment. It's kind of projecting out to the future, where are they to be at the middle of year, and kind of as things are progressing forward throughout a school year. So this is definitely a little bit of a different look at the data. It's really trying to quantify more of where would we have expected these students to be performing had the pandemic not happened, going from one year to the next. And how has that differed? And then ultimately, as you said, Kristen, trying to quantify it in terms of some type of meaningful effect size value that can be interpreted.
If I could ask a second question, John. So what you were showing effect sizes for school year 2020 in that beginning of year and middle of year example, and then they were not color coded. And then you had the example of the effect size color coded. It was a red, I think it was a minus 0.44 or something, the difference. Is there anything for districts to learn or take away if they see, let's say an effect size in 2020 that's negative, and let's just say it's -3. I'm just going to make up something that would, be significant, not in a good direction. And then they also see a red effect size in terms of the difference in 2021. Sorry, yeah, 2021. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean,
Like, in other words, are we also seeing some information there that says we had issues before the pandemic?
yes. So in the example of just looking at 2020, again, it's more similar to the way PVAAS works in that we're comparing the amount of growth or the deviation between observed and expected. It's relative to the average experience seen across a group in that given year. And so with a very negative effect size in 2020 alone, that's not color coded, what that says is the experience that your students seem to have had going from 1819 to 1920 was less than the average experience in terms of growth, if you will, or the difference between observed and expected that the other LEAs administering that same assessment had. Likewise, if you have a very positive value on this difference, that means you were performing above average in terms of comparing the previous year's testing data to the 2020 observed testing data. So for whatever reason, students seem to have tested above expected. So that kind of sets the control, if you will, of, well, what was our typical experience with our students kind of relative to the group? Because we can't just base these models on your district and district alone. We have to base them on a larger set of data. And so we base them on a large set of data. You know how you differ relative to that larger set of data based on the 2020 year. And then the 2021 year, it's based on the same way of creating an expected score as in 2020, meaning that it's based on a pre-pandemic expectation. So on average, across all the LEAs in 2021, they're probably still going to be negative, but this allows you to not only say, okay, well, maybe this value is negative, but how much different is it relative to what we saw in the 2020 school year? And it's really when those two things differ a lot that you're starting to see, yes, the experience of my students in the 2021 school year was much different than what we saw in an average year. And so that difference part that's color coded really gives you an indication that our experience definitely changed from one year to the next. And based on students now have gone through the school disruptions and the pandemic itself.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. I think it lends validation to, we've kind of had this, we've had this gap in terms of the, state assessment data. However, we have historical data that's sitting there. And I know we've had some conversations with districts and schools about, if you've had some history, let's say, of growth in a positive direction or in the less than positive direction, have you either figured out what lets you move in a positive direction previously, or you did not yet resolve why you were yielding growth results pre-pandemic that were red? If you haven't resolved that yet, like there might still be work to do before the pandemic even hit. So I just had us starting to connect history before and after the pandemic here as we were looking at the reporting that you were sharing. So thank you.
No problem.
Anybody else have any questions? Questions you might anticipate that your, districts or schools, might ask. I know we have IUs on here. We have, LEAs, range of LEAs that are on here as well. Any questions you're thinking people might ask? So we did get a question on how to schedule the review. So John, could you give us an update on the kind of timing, what, when you anticipate this reporting may be available? I know you guys are working on all the details with that, so not asking you to lock us into a day, because I know it doesn't work that way, but is there, kind of an estimated time frame that you might hope to have the reports to us here in Pennsylvania that we can then disseminate them to LEAs?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that they're going to be really wrapped up really soon, like maybe next couple of weeks is what I would hope to say.
Okay.
And obviously, the earlier we can get them out to everybody, the more so we will. But yeah, I don't. It's hard to commit to an exact day. I know some of the holidays are coming up with Thanksgiving and things like that. So we may, be kind of trying to play with before or after some of the holidays. So, but we will definitely be trying to get them out to you guys as quickly as we can. And I would say the next few weeks.
Yeah, no, we know and we appreciate the great care you take in putting together any reporting that goes out to LEAs. Once we receive those, we will then email those directly to the superintendent and CEO. And the reason I asked that was the question was, how do we schedule, those one-on-one sessions? I think when that's received, that's the time to go ahead and send a message in if you'd like to set up a session with our team, PVAAS at iu13.org. I don't think it makes sense to try to guess to schedule those now. Instead, let's get those scheduled. When you're ready, when your superintendent or CEO receives the actual report, we can do that then. So John, there's a couple other questions that are in here. So if districts did not provide maybe it's 3 years of data, is there any impact on that in terms of what districts would see with the reporting? So amount of data that districts had available.
Yeah, let me try to go back to one of these example slides real quick, and I can try to walk through, what would and wouldn't be available, because it does get a little tricky. So in order to create an expected score for the 2020 group, you had to have 18-19 beginning of year and middle of year data, because that's what creates your expected value of the 2020 group of students. And then of course, you have to have an observed score for the 2020 group of students in either the BOY or MOY in order to have the comparison or the ability for us to have an observed and expected. So that's what has to happen to have these values here. And then in order to have the values on the right-hand side, or the 2021 group, you have to have the beginning of year and middle of year from the 1920 school year to create your expected score. And then you have to have your observed test scores from the 2021 school year, beginning or middle of year. So again, you can see in this case, most likely, maybe this LEA didn't have the observed test scores for the beginning of year grade 1 in 2021. And that's why all of these are missing. But it's really those 3 years in order to get each of these different values in order to create this one on the far right-hand side. So in some cases, if you didn't administer 18-19 data at all, you just have 19-20 and 2021, then you're only going to see information on the right-hand side for the 2021 COVID group. That's still going to tell you, how those students did based on a pre-pandemic expectation. What you're not going to be able to determine is, do you typically do something below or above average so that you can compare to it? But it still will give you some information about where students scored relative to that pre-pandemic expectation. Likewise, if you don't have any 2021 data, obviously you're not going to have any of this differences in effect size for the 2021 COVID group, because you don't have the observed test scores. You would have to have the 18-19 and the 19-20 data to produce the group on the left-hand side. So yes, you have to have all 3 years to get everything. You have to have the 2 earlier years to get the left side, the 2 right years to get the right side. And then obviously the administration needs to happen kind of from one grade to the next in order to create these expected scores. I hope that helps kind of give you an idea on the amount of data that's required.
Yeah, that's helpful, John. And I would say to everybody, who's on here, that we will have those type of details included in the FAQ as well. So we have another section that'll be added to the local assessment FAQ document for this specific unfinished teaching and learning reporting. So that type of information we'll make sure is well spelled out in there as well. And a link will be included to that FAQ when the report gets sent to your superintendent or CEO. So we'll make sure to do that. John, another question. What would you say is, so if I take a look at this and I'm seeing that the changes between pre-pandemic, and pandemic performance aren't very different, what value is that to me, as an LEA? What is that value if I'm not really seeing the differences, really not much of a difference?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of them to look at first. Maybe overall you look at some of the first pages and say, you know what, I don't really see that much of a difference by individual subject grade of how we were doing based on our control group versus our COVID group. I would encourage you then to look also at the student group data, because maybe while you didn't see a difference with your overall average, you saw a difference with your economically disadvantaged students, or you saw a difference potentially with one of the racial categories, or students with IEPs or something like that. And you will still have comparisons again to the control group for that same set of students and the COVID group for that same set of students. Now, if you literally saw no differences across all of your student groups, and at your individual school level and the overall LEA level, then I guess I would feel pretty happy. It's certainly not something that we are seeing so much in any of the states that we are. Well, let me step back. In general, at the state level, we're seeing a pretty significant impact on math in all of the states that we work with, and then maybe a smaller impact on the ELA side in all of the states that we're working with on average. That's not to say that an individual LEA is going to see as much of an impact, as another LEA. And then even within your LEA, you may want to consider all of your individual buildings. Is it possible that some of your buildings did things a little differently? May have seen a larger impact in some buildings as compared to others. So all of those things are available to you in terms of ways to look at the data. Yes, but at the end of it all, if you're not seeing any differences, then I would feel pretty happy about the situation.
Great, thank you, John. That's the last question that I see in here, I think, for the whole group as I'm scanning through. If I missed anything, Brian Campbell, let me know. But I think we've captured the questions. There was some questions about what would an IU receive, and we'll be having communications out with the intermediate units. These are reports that will go only to the LEA. IUs will know who receives these, so they know who they might want to reach out to if they need support, but the reports themselves will just be sent direct to that specific LEA, since this is a different type of data. So that's all we had here, I think, Brian.
Okay, yeah, I don't see any additional questions either, but I do want to take a second. First off, absolutely thank John White for being with us today from North Carolina and from SAS helping us out. This is super helpful information, and a preemptive thank you, I guess, for Kristen and her team with the PVAAS and school improvement work. When we do get to those individual sessions and things like that, and we'll be rolling out to help folks interpret their results and also remember tying those results back to instruction, which is the second part of this and really the key part of this, to make sure we're making good data informed decisions as we move forward. The one reason we've kind of created the accelerated support system and the roadmap, is to keep in mind that the pandemic affected everyone differently. Each LEA and obviously stakeholders, even the stakeholders inside of each LEA, differently. And what we can't do is just, set our curriculum back a year or back 3 months or whatever, and put all kids on the road. We're going to have to look at this and make some decisions, and PD is going to be here to help give you those resources so that we can do some smart things inside of our curriculum with some, data and some flexible grouping and some supports and acceleration, and get folks caught up and back on track, early as we pull out of the pandemic. So I appreciate everyone tuning in today. I know how busy everyone is. So we always appreciate your time and your dedication. We know that you are, as school leaders, the folks up front on all this. So know how much we appreciate your leadership and your dedication to the kids right now. That's always the most important thing, and it hasn't been easy. So we're very appreciative and just very proud of the work you all are doing in PA. And we will continue to update the roadmap. And we have, again, one more webinar upcoming in about 2 weeks on the local assessment project. You'll be getting your reports back, and again, being able to work with Kristen and her team. So thanks everyone for today, and stay tuned for more updates as we go.